Hi, it's my honor and privilege today to tell you my parents' story. My sons, who are 27 and 29, attended school at Dorseyville Middle School. I'm very blessed that my parents, who are both Holocaust survivors, are alive and well at 91 and 92 years old. They were both hidden children in France during World War II. As time goes by, the voices and the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust are quickly dwindling, and it's my generation and yours to carry their torch. The Anti-Defamation League, a leading anti-hate organization in the United States, determined that in 2018, there were 1,859 anti-Semitic incidents here. Not one day goes by that I don't hear about another one here or abroad. In November of 2018, shortly after the Tree of Life massacre here in Pittsburgh, my sister spoke at a vigil in Brooklyn, New York. And in part of her speech, she mentioned that my dad would always say to herself and me, you know, the Holocaust could never happen again, and you better have your passports ready to go to Israel. My sister would respond, Dad, this is the United States. That would never happen here. I personally don't think that the Holocaust could ever happen again, but with the climate in the world today, we have reason to be concerned. My mom, Edith Leuchter, was born in Bruchsal, Germany on December 31st, 1927. Her father owned Max Loeb grocery store, named after him, and he sold canned goods and produce, butcher supplies, and tools. The family lived above the grocery store. In July of 1938, after Max saw the handwriting on the wall, he emigrated to the United States. The plan was to send for everybody else, but unfortunately that never happened. When he got to New York, he sent this telegram to his wife and children. As you can see, the telegram has the swastika on it. On Kristallnacht, otherwise known as the Night of Broken Glass, November 9th and 10th, 1938, Edith was awakened in the wee hours of the morning. She could hear sirens and breaking glass and couldn't even see the flames outside of her window, at which point she crawled into bed with her mother, Yulia, to seek comfort. Yulia said it was no longer safe to stay, so they moved to Matilda Weil's house, Edith's grandmother, about 10 minutes away. Soon after, Heinz, Edith's brother, who is pictured here, was sent to a school in Frankfurt. Edith's aunt said there wasn't enough food for them in the home in Bruchsal, as there were already shortages, and he was sent to that school. Edith is bitter about it to this day because she feels that if Heinz wasn't sent away, things could have turned out differently. From that school, he was moved to an orphanage in Frankfurt and eventually deported to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. This was the model camp that Hitler invited the Red Cross to visit to show how well he was treating the prisoners, which obviously wasn't true. In May 1944, he was deported to Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp in Poland. He was put in a specific area called the Theresian family camp. 17,517 people were deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. As the Allies were beginning to learn about the Holocaust, this camp was created within Auschwitz to mislead the world about the final solution. Heinz was on a transport of 2,499 people. Upon arrival, he was given a prisoner number between A1445 and A2506. Of the 17,517 people who were deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, only 261 survived. My mother's brother Heinz was not one of them. He either died of starvation or disease, or was killed in the gas chambers. This is a picture of a letter that he actually sent from Theresienstadt to his aunt and uncle who were still in Germany. And as you can see, the postage stamp has Hitler on it. On October 22nd, 1940, about 29,000 Jews were deported from Bruchsal and surrounding areas in Germany. Edith, Her mother, Yulia, and her grandmother, Matilda, were given 1 hour to get their things ready to walk to the railroad station in the town. They could only bring a few suitcases. Right here is a frame, and I'm going to show you some footage as well. This is actually my mother and her grandmother. You see, we only discovered this footage a few years ago in the Bruchsal, Germany archives. This past February, we discovered that my mother and her grandmother are in the footage. It's possible that Edith's grandmother is in the photograph as well, right here. But Edith could only confirm that it's herself and her mother. This was obviously extremely upsetting to my mother and her entire family. My apologies, I'm having technical difficulties. Again, here's my grandmother and my mother. When they got to the railroad station, Yulia asked for permission to call her son Heinz, who was in Frankfurt, to see if he could join them. She was denied this request, but she was given approval to go back home to look for the papers she said she had to emigrate to the United States. She went back twice, but for whatever reason, the papers were not there. From inside the railroad station, they could see outside the windows. Townspeople, including children, were yelling that they were happy to see the Jews leave Bruchsal, and they were spitting on them. Eventually, they boarded the train and they breathed a small sigh of relief because as they crossed the Rhine River, they realized they were traveling south as opposed to east towards Poland. A few days later, they arrived in southwestern France when they were put into an internment camp called Gurs. Edith had to use straw to make mattresses, and there were too few blankets for too many people. Edith described that it was extremely disgusting and very muddy. She went to school, but she learned very little there. In April of 1941, her and her mother and her grandmother were deported to another camp called Rivesaltes, near the area of Perpignan, still in the south of France. By this point, Yulia had a hernia and was ill. At this camp, the barracks were infested with insects, and according to my mom, the beds looked like cages for rabbits. One bright spot was that Max, Edith's father, was able to send packages and money from the United States. Edith was always hungry. She says the food consisted of watery soup with vegetables that looked like weeds. Yulia was able to save the bread that they were rationed in the morning until the evening to give Edith to Edith when she got back from school. Yulia had rosy cheeks, and the other prisoners were actually jealous because they thought they were getting more food from them than them. The Vichy government of France gave the difficult choice to the parents in the camp to sign their children over to an organization called OSE, which translates to Children's Aid Society. This was a Jewish underground organization that operated throughout the war and saved over 5,000 Jewish children. Edith had to say goodbye to her mother and her grandmother Matilda, but she could not hug Matilda, as Matilda had already had body lice at this point. A few months later, she got a telegram from her mother that she was deported to Drancy, another internment camp in Paris, and eventually deported to Auschwitz. She hoped that she didn't make it there and died of the hernia in the cattle car on the long trip there. She also found out that her grandmother Matilda died in a hospital in Perpignan and luckily wasn't deported. By the end of the war, Edith was in 5 schools and orphanages. While she was in one school, she was also a part-time nanny for a family from the area of Alsace-Lorraine, which is the geographic area between France and Germany. Edith's false papers indicated that she was also from that area, which made sense because she was from Germany and was already learning French. Here she was given the false name Edith Labey. My mother was also in an orphanage called Majelier for about 1.5 years. She made a lot of friends there, and she also met a boy named Kurt, and he really liked her, but she thought he was a big shot and didn't pay much attention to him. Toward the end of the war, she became a French Girl Scout, and upon liberation, was able to get an affidavit from her father, Max, and immigrated to the United States. She reached the port of New York on April 23rd, 1946. This is an ad that Max placed in a German Jewish newspaper called the Aufbau, where he was searching for his wife and his son, my uncle and my grandmother, who were killed in Auschwitz. My father, Kurt Leuchter, was born in Vienna, Austria, on February 6th, 1929. His father, Moritz, owned a wholesale silk business called Leuchter and Granig. My father was an only child, but he had many friends, and he and his parents went on vacations, and life was pretty good. On March 12, 1938, all that changed, as that's when Germany was annexed by Austria, otherwise known as the Anschluss. At this point, all the borders were closed. On Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Kurt was sent home early from school at about 9:30 in the morning. On his way home from school, he saw a synagogue burning, and the SS were shooting and dragging the men out of the synagogue, forcing them to throw the Torahs, our Jewish Bibles, into the Danube River. He hurried home. When he got to his apartment building, he saw that the SS were arresting his father and 9 other Jewish men. He asked them, "Where are you taking my father?" But they just yelled at him to go upstairs. So Kurt sat on the steps, crying, and waited for his mother, Rosa, to return from her shopping trip. She knew it was too dangerous to stay, so they walked 3 blocks to Kurt's grandmother's house. On their way, 2 SS approached them. One grabbed Kurt by the hair, and the other grabbed Rosa by the hair and threw them down onto the street. A woman passerby tried to help them, but the SS threatened her with being sent to Dachau concentration camp. When they got to Kurt's grandmother's house, Kurt's cousin Heinz and Aunt Paula were there as well. 10 days later, there was a knock at the door. They were afraid to open it because they thought it was the SS, but Aunt Paula looked through the peephole and saw somebody looking very dirty and disheveled and thought it was probably safe to open the door. Upon opening it, to their surprise, it was Moritz, my grandfather. He was held in an armory, and the SS treated him badly and threatened to cut off his finger if he couldn't take off his wedding ring, which fortunately he was finally able to do. Moritz was told by the Nazis that they had 3 months to get their families out of Austria. Moritz was able to procure a visa via Genoa, Italy, and in February of 1939, by way of Cologne, Germany, and Brussels, they ended up in Antwerp, Belgium. They had with them just a few suitcases and a bit of jewelry that they had hidden in their clothing. Here, Kurt learned how to speak Flemish and French, and went to school, and things were quiet for a while. They ended up living very near a man who happened to be from the town of Brody, Poland, which happens to be Moritz's hometown. He moved to Vienna when he was a little boy. One night, when Kurt was eavesdropping on his parents' conversation, he heard that the neighbor let them hide a bit of jewelry in a washcloth in his basement wall. On May 10th, 1940, everything was upended again, and at 6 a.m. in the morning, the Germans invaded Belgium and all the Jewish men were arrested. Moritz was deported by the Belgians to the south of France. In July of 1940, Rosa and Kurt were moved to a detention camp in Louwburg, Belgium. And Paula and the cousin were still in Antwerp. See, Paula didn't look Jewish, as she had blonde hair and blue eyes. So she approached the Gestapo to get papers for them to move to Paris, France, and was given permission. They lived there for 2 months, but they wanted to be near Moritz, so they hired a guide to take them across the demarcation line. It was very dangerous. They crossed at night with 14 other Jews. The SS were guarding the border with guard dogs and machine guns. Luckily, they crossed without incident, and at this point, they boarded a train in Marseille in the south of France. And Paul and the cousin got off in Toulouse. Kurt and Rosa were supposed to go to Marseille, but accidentally got off the train one stop before, which was extremely dangerous because they had no ID papers. Somehow, at 11 years old, Kurt had the wherewithal to push his mother through the train station. They registered with the Jewish agency and were put in a detention camp called Hotel Terminus. By this time, Moritz was in 3 camps already. Saint-Cyprien, Gers, which I had actually mentioned earlier in my mother's story, but they were in different sections and never crossed paths, and now Camp Les Milles. My father was able to bring food to his father on the weekends. The camp was about 30 miles from where he and his mother were. At one point, Rosa and Kurt were moved to the same camp. All 3 were able to get a pass to go to the city of Marseille, and my father had his bar mitzvah there at a synagogue. Soon after that, in August 1942, Kurt's parents were given that same difficult choice to turn their son over to OSE, and on August 9, 1942, they signed the papers. This is the last letter that Rosa and Moritz, my grandparents, wrote to Kurt. Basically, they were looking for him to procure food for them and that he should take care of everything and please make them proud. Months later, Kurt found out that Rosa and Moritz were both killed in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Kurt was now placed in a place called Hotel Bompard, which was repurposed as a detention camp. The conditions weren't good there either, obviously, so he and some friends decided to escape one night when the French police were drunk. They got caught and were brought back to Bompard. The second time they escaped, they were more careful and went undetected. Somehow they knew there was a home sponsored by OSE called Majelier. There my father was able to procure food from nearby farmers on a bicycle with a wagon. Here's where he met a young girl named Edith, who he liked, but as I mentioned earlier, she was not a fan. Kurt and his friends were told they could go to the port of Marseille and board a ship for the United States. But at that point, the U.S. had reached Africa and the German U-boats were bombing the armed forces, so he was sent back to the orphanage for a brief period of time. In February 1943, Kurt was moved to a boys' delinquent home in a town called Jolet-Bois. The director of the home, Mademoiselle Burel, knew he was Jewish, and she had a connection to the mayor of that town, and they were able to provide false papers to Kurt. His new name was now Claude Lambert. He too was supposed to be from Alsace-Lorraine because he was from Austria, so he spoke German, and he was also learning French. Here he cooked and chopped wood and performed various other chores. Months later, somebody squealed that there was a Jewish boy hiding in the home, so the Nazis came looking for him. He was hiding in an armoire for several hours, and luckily the Nazis didn't open the closet. But Mademoiselle Burel knew Kurt could no longer stay there safely, and she made a connection for him to the Maquis, the French underground. And for the next year, Kurt lived in the woods and helped to blow up the last truck of German convoys and the rails that they passed. They received French, British, and American assistance. Upon liberation, he was sent to 2 more orphanages in Lyon, France, and in Paris. At one point, he went back to the neighbor in Antwerp, Belgium. Sure enough, the jewelry was still in the washcloth in the basement wall, and he was able to bring his father's gold pocket watch and his mother's bracelet and wedding ring to the United States. In Paris, he got a job making leather handbags, and in the evening attended technical school. His uncle was already living in the United States and was able to get a visa for him. In August of 1946, he boarded the French troop ship called the Athos, and with 67 other orphans, arrived in the port of New York on September 8, 1946. In January 1947, my father was standing outside the Museum of Modern Art on the sidewalk just chatting with his friends, when who should tap him on the shoulder but Edith, the girl he liked in Montpellier, the orphanage. They embraced, and Edith must have seen something different in Kurt this time because they fell in love. And on August 13, 1950, they were married, which coincidentally is my oldest son's birthday. In January of 1952, my father was drafted into the U.S. Army and spent 9 months in Korea on the 38th parallel. Luckily, he made it home safe. He worked for Columbia Broadcasting System, which is now CBS, and did TV repairs for a short while. Eventually, he became an aerospace engineer without a college degree. My father worked on the guidance navigation system of a couple of different Apollo missions, and his name, which is right here, along with several other 100 engineers, is still on microfiche on the moon. I have this plaque in my home, which you might be able to see just behind me because I'm recording from a bedroom. On the left is a plaque with the lunar module, and then behind me is another plaque with the rocket, et cetera, and hundreds of engineers' signatures, including my father's. In 2011, my father was awarded the Legion of Honor Medal for World War II veterans by the French government. When I read the letter that accompanied it, something just didn't jive. I knew my father was a Holocaust survivor, a Korean War veteran, and that his name was on the moon, but then realized for the first time that since he fought in the French resistance, he's a World War II veteran as well. In 2017, my family was fortunate enough to travel to my mother's hometown in Brussels, Germany, and we had 5 Stolpersteins installed. Stolperstein means stumbling stone. The artist, pictured here, Günter Denmig, who isn't Jewish, started this project in Berlin in 1996. He lays these stones or brass markers in front of the homes of people who were deported, whether they were killed or not. Currently, there are over 75,000 Stolpersteins in 24 countries, and it's considered the largest deconstructed Holocaust memorial in the world. So we had 5 installed, one for Julia and Max, my grandmother and my uncle, my grandmother and grandfather, my maternal grandparents, and for Heinz and Edith, my mother and my uncle, and my maternal grandmother, Matilda Weil. This is her prayer book from the 1880s, which somehow survived, and we were able to use it to recite a Jewish morning prayer during the ceremony. This is also her signature that's in the inside of the prayer book. The townspeople of Brussels were absolutely wonderful in that they welcomed us with open arms and were extremely generous of heart. Several spent part of an evening and the day of the ceremony with my family. There was also an assembly at the middle school with presentations by 8th grade students. We also had the opportunity to visit my great-grandfather's grave, pictured here, in a nearby cemetery and town. He died long before World War II. I grew up on Long Island, New York, in a loving but complicated home. My parents were extremely overprotective, understandably so. My first experience with anti-Semitism was in 1st grade when my classmate called me a dirty Jew. In junior high school, a boy set firecrackers in the stairwell as I left for the day. When I was 16 and home alone, the mailbox affixed to our house was blown up, and eggs were thrown at our house on an occasional basis. At my current job many years ago, my former boss, who sat not too far away from me, was on the phone one day, and I overheard him saying to a customer, "Well, why don't you just do him down?" And then more recently, in the last few years, my husband Mark and I overheard a couple of people who we know use the term Jewish lightning. I didn't even know what that was, so I went home and Googled it. Basically, what it means is when somebody burns down their business for the insurance money. How it became an anti-Semitic trope, I have no clue. In 2019, the brother of my classmate who called me a dirty Jew in first grade made a post on a Facebook group of my high school and was just sharing a lot of memories and apologizing for being a bully, etc. And I decided to add a comment mentioning what his sister had said to me. And he contacted his sister, and she wrote me this email. My adult self is not shocked to see this given what was said and taught in my house, but I am no less ashamed, horrified, and saddened, especially when I see how this has stuck with you and hurt you so badly. If it's any comfort, I am not the same person and do not advocate hate against anyone and don't tolerate it in my life. Maybe it's some comfort in knowing that I have not continued to hurt others like I hurt you. Thank you for being open to my message. It's great to hear it had a positive effect. In some ways, that truly changed my life, plus I now add it to the story that I tell. So this is my family. My mother, that's her as a little girl before the war, and that's my father on the right, just after getting out of the French underground. That's me in the middle, and my parents on either side of me, and my sister and her daughters Amanda and Jennifer, and my children who went to DMS, Jeremy and Nathan. My parents are 91 and 92 and live in Boynton Beach, Florida. My father is on an advisory board for Jewish Family and Children's Services to help allocate funds for Holocaust survivors who need it. And he also volunteers for the Jewish War Veterans of America and shares his story at local schools. My mom sings in old age homes. My mother's last name is Lowe, which means strong man or lion. And my father's last name is Leuchter, which means candelabra. I'd like to think that the strength and many branches of my family that now exist give us all light and hope for the future. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that if you have any questions, Mr. Wenzel will give you my email address and I'll be happy to answer any of them. And I hope that you have a good rest of the school year. Thanks.